In 1991, audiences wept as Captain Kirk placed a photo of his son on his desk, a moment of profound cinematic grief. But the truth behind that lens was far more devastating than any script. The young man in the frame, Merritt Butrick, had already been dead for 2 years, not as a hero in an intergalactic battle, but alone in a cold Hollywood room. His death was not an accident. It was the finale of a slow suicide, a brilliant mind crushed by undiagnosed mental illness, addiction, and the ruthlessness of an industry that squeezed him dry until his final breath. Join us as we look past the glamour to reveal the heartbreaking tragedy of the Star Trek prince who destroyed himself in the dark. Merritt Butrick was born on September 3, 1959, in Gainesville, Florida. Merritt was an only child, the son of an Air Force Master Sergeant. This military background is crucial. The household of a career military man in the mid-20th century was typically defined by order, discipline, and a specific brand of stoic masculinity. Emotions were not things to be explored. They were things to be controlled. Weakness was not tolerated. From a very young age, Merritt was an outlier. He didn't fit the mold of the rough-and-tumble Florida boy. He was slight, wiry, and possessed an intelligence that unnerved adults. He wasn't just smart, he was precocious, with a mind that seemed to run at a higher RPM than everyone else's. Friends from his youth recall a boy who was intensely private, yet capable of sudden bursts of manic energy. He was the class clown, but not in the look-at-me way of a typical extrovert. His humor was sharper, stranger, often deflecting attention away from his true self. He graduated from Tamalpais High School in Mill Valley, California, after the family moved west. This geographical shift from the swamps of Florida to the liberal counterculture remnants of Northern California in the 70s was the first major fracture in his life. He was exposed to a world that valued expression over repression. He found theater. Acting wasn't just a hobby for Merritt, it was a survival mechanism. For a young man grappling with an internal chaos he couldn't name, the stage offered a container. On stage, you are told what to feel, you are told what to say. The chaos has a script. For someone with undiagnosed bipolar disorder, which we now know Merritt suffered from, the structure of a play must have felt like a relief. It was a safe place to be too much. By the late 1970s, Merritt knew he wanted to be an actor, but he didn't want to be a movie star, at least not in the shallow sense. He considered himself an artist. He enrolled in the California Institute of the Arts, a prestigious and avant-garde institution founded by Walt Disney. CalArts in the late 70s was a hotbed of experimentalism. It wasn't about learning how to hit your mark and smile for the camera. It was about breaking down the self. It was about Grotowski, Artaud, and the theater of cruelty. It was a place where students were encouraged to strip themselves bare emotionally. For a stable student, this training is intense. For Merritt, it was gasoline on a fire. He thrived there initially. His professors recognized a raw, unpolished genius. He had a quality that can't be taught: presence. When he was in a room, the air changed. He was beautiful in an unconventional way: sharp cheekbones, intense blue eyes, and a physicality that was both rigid and graceful. He looked like a synthesis of James Dean and a frightened bird. However, the intense psychological excavation required by serious acting training began to destabilize him. The line between character and self, already thin for Merritt, began to blur. He started to gain a reputation for being difficult, not because he was arrogant, but because he was unpredictable. He would have days of immense creative euphoria where he could outact anyone in the room, followed by black periods of withdrawal where he wouldn't speak. He dropped out before graduating. This decision is often framed as a young actor eager to start his career, but in hindsight, it looks more like an escape. The pressure of the academic environment, the constant scrutiny, the demand to constantly feel it was too much. He packed his bags and headed south to the sprawling concrete jungle of Los Angeles. Merritt arrived in Hollywood at the dawn of a new decade, the 1970s, the era of the gritty anti-hero, of Pacino and De Niro, of complex moral ambiguity, was dying. The 1980s were rolling in, bringing with them a cultural shift that would define Merritt's career and his ultimate tragedy. Reagan was coming into power. The mood in America was shifting toward consumerism, traditional values, and a glossy, hard-edged optimism. Hollywood was following suit. The studios were moving away from difficult, character-driven dramas and toward high-concept blockbusters. They wanted muscular heroes. They wanted Stallone and Schwarzenegger. They wanted clear-cut good guys and bad guys. Los Angeles in 1980 was a city of predators. It was a time of easy money and cheap cocaine. The Sunset Strip was a neon carnival of hair metal bands and aspiring starlets. But for a young, broke actor, the city was a grinder. Merritt settled into the life of the struggling artist. He lived in cheap apartments, taking whatever odd jobs he could find. But unlike the thousands of other blonde-haired boys getting off the bus at the Greyhound station, Merritt had an edge. He had that Cal Arts training. He had an intensity that was undeniable. He began hitting the audition circuit. Casting directors didn't know what to do with him. He wasn't the jock. He wasn't the nerd. He wasn't the leading man in the traditional sense. He was too fey for the action roles, too intense for the comedies. He occupied a liminal space, a character actor trapped in the body of a devastatingly handsome young man. This ambiguity, which made him difficult to cast, also made him magnetic. In a sea of generic faces, Merritt Butrick stuck out. He had a nervous energy that read well on camera. It looked like danger. In 1980 and 1981, doctors in Los Angeles and New York were beginning to notice clusters of strange symptoms in young, healthy gay men. Rare pneumonias, skin cancers that usually only affected the elderly. They called it GRID at first. Later, it would be known as AIDS. Merritt was gay. In 1980s, Hollywood, this was a career death sentence if publicized. The industry was deeply homophobic. While many people behind the scenes, makeup artists, writers, directors, were gay, the actors in front of the camera had to maintain a strict facade of heterosexuality. Rock Hudson was still playing the straight romantic lead. The closet was not just a place of secrecy, it was a contractual obligation. Merritt lived a double life. By day, he was the aspiring actor, auditioning for roles where he had to flirt with girls and play the all-American son. By night, he was navigating the underground gay scene of Los Angeles. This duality created a fracture in his psyche. He was forced to hide the most fundamental part of his identity to succeed in an industry that fetishized authenticity while demanding artificiality. The pressure was immense, and Merritt, with his undiagnosed bipolar disorder, had no healthy way to process it. He began to self-medicate. It started socially, drinking, partying. But Merritt didn't have an off switch. The highs of the manic episodes demanded fuel, and the lows of the depressive episodes demanded numbing. He drifted toward harder substances. Cocaine was the drug of the era. It was everywhere, on every casting couch, in every bathroom, at every industry party. For a manic depressive, cocaine is a disastrous accelerant. It mimics the manic high, making the user feel godlike, invincible before dropping them into a paranoid abyss. Merritt was walking a tightrope. He was talented, beautiful, and on the verge of breaking through. But he was also lonely, mentally ill, and hiding a secret identity in a town that punished difference. Despite the personal chaos, his talent was undeniable. He started booking small gigs, a guest spot here, a commercial there. He was building a reel. His first significant role, and the one that would introduce him to the American public, came in 1982. The show was called Square Pegs. It was a sitcom, but it was trying to be different. Created by Ann Beats, a writer from Saturday Night Live, it was the anti-sitcom. No laugh track, focusing on the awkward losers rather than the cheerleaders. Merritt auditioned for the role of Johnny Slash. On paper, the character was a one-note joke, a spaced-out new waver who was possibly brain-dead. The network wanted a caricature, but Merritt walked into the audition room and made a choice that would define his career. He decided that Johnny wasn't stupid. Instead, he played him with a terrifying stillness, vibrating on a frequency that simply didn't exist for the other characters. While the other actors were frenetic, Merritt was a void of calm, delivering his lines with a deliberate, hypnotic cadence. He gave the character a soul. The producers were mesmerized. He got the part immediately. When Square Pegs premiered in September 1982, it was a critical darling, and Merritt became the breakout star. Johnny Slash became a minor cultural phenomenon. His catchphrases like "totally different head, totally" were repeated in school hallways across America. Merritt was suddenly on the cover of Teen Beat and Tiger Beat. But there was a profound irony in this fame. The audience loved Johnny Slash because he was detached and cool. In reality, Merritt was raw and intensely vulnerable. The character of Johnny Slash became a mask, a protective layer of eccentricity. Johnny was safe. Johnny didn't have bipolar disorder. Johnny wasn't a closeted gay man terrified of the AIDS epidemic. Johnny was just new wave. This role allowed Merritt to channel his natural eccentricity, the manic energy, the strange associative thinking patterns of his illness, into something commercially viable. Hollywood looked at his symptoms and called them acting choices. But as the cameras started rolling, the pressure cooker of network television was about to test Merritt Butrick's fragile stability in ways he was completely unprepared for. While the critics loved Square Pegs, the atmosphere behind the scenes was deteriorating. The show was filmed in an abandoned high school in Norwalk, California, far from the studio lots. This isolation bred a chaotic environment. Rumors began to swirl about drug use on set. Not necessarily among the teenage cast. Sarah Jessica Parker was famously disciplined, but among the production staff and the wider circle of the show. It was 1982 after all. Cocaine was the fuel of the entertainment industry. For Merritt, this environment was dangerous. He was a young man with a brain chemistry that was already volatile. He was prone to extreme highs and crushing lows. Placing a person with untreated bipolar disorder in a high-pressure, drug-fueled environment is like lighting a match in a room full of dynamite. Colleagues from that time remember Merritt as being intense. He would stay in character between takes. He was obsessive about his performance. He wasn't just showing up to say his lines. He was trying to turn a teen sitcom into high art. He would argue about the motivation of a line reading. He would stress over the blocking. This intensity was often misread as arrogance or method pretension. In reality, it was anxiety. It was the desperate need for control in a mind that felt like it was spinning out of control. Despite the critical acclaim, Square Pegs was canceled after just one season. The official reason was low ratings, but the industry whisper was that CBS was uncomfortable with the drug rumors surrounding the production. They wanted a clean ship. Square Pegs was too messy. The cancellation devastated Merritt. For a bipolar mind, rejection is not just a professional setback, it is a confirmation of catastrophic worthlessness. The structure that the show provided, the call times, the scripts, the identity of Johnny Slash, vanished overnight. He was unemployed again. And now he had a new problem: typecasting. To the industry, he was Johnny Slash. He was the weird guy. Casting directors couldn't see him as a serious, dramatic actor. They just saw the funny haircut and the deadpan delivery. He was in danger of becoming a novelty act, a piece of 80s trivia before his career had even truly begun. He needed a miracle. He needed a role that would shatter the sitcom clown image and prove he was a heavyweight. And then the phone rang. It was Paramount. They were looking for the son of Captain Kirk. The production of Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, is legendary in Hollywood history. The franchise was on life support. Star Trek. The motion picture had been a bloated, expensive bore. Paramount wanted to do a sequel on the cheap, and they hired Nicholas Meyer, a director who had never seen a single episode of the original show, to fix it. Meyer wanted to make a submarine movie in space. He wanted gritty realism. He wanted naval textures. And crucially, the script called for a bombshell revelation. James T. Kirk, the intergalactic playboy, had a son. The role of David Marcus was a minefield. The actor had to be believable as a brilliant scientist. He had to have the physical presence to stand up to William Shatner. He had to be handsome enough to be Kirk's offspring, but different enough to show why they were estranged. If they cast a mini Kirk, a swaggering macho jock, it wouldn't work. The conflict wouldn't be interesting. David had to be everything Kirk wasn't. Kirk was instinct. David was intellect. Kirk was the military. David was the pacifist. Kirk was the establishment. David was the rebel. Hundreds of actors read for the role. Every young blonde in Hollywood wanted it. Merritt walked into the audition with Nicholas Meyer. He didn't play it safe. He didn't try to be a sci-fi hero. He played David with a chip on his shoulder the size of the Enterprise. He played him as a wounded, arrogant, brilliant young man who deeply resented the father he never knew. Meyer, a director who valued theatricality and intelligence, saw it immediately. He saw the fire behind Merritt's eyes. He saw the vulnerability that Merritt tried so hard to hide. "That's the guy," Meyer reportedly said. "That's Kirk's son." Filming The Wrath of Khan was a different beast from the chaotic set of Square Pegs. This was a major motion picture. The sets were massive. The costumes were heavy wool. The lighting was dark and atmospheric. Merritt was stepping into the ring with heavyweights: William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, DeForest Kelley. These men had been playing these characters for 15 years. They had a rhythm, a shorthand. Merritt was the intruder. And honestly, his character was an intruder. David Marcus disrupts the equilibrium of Kirk's life. The pivotal scene for Merritt, and perhaps the best scene of his entire career, takes place in the Genesis cave. Kirk, McCoy, and David are trapped underground. The tension is palpable. David, believing they are doomed, lashes out at Kirk. "You really are a general, aren't you?" David sneers. "You'd kill us all just to beat him." Watch that scene again. Look at Merritt's body language. He's practically vibrating with rage. He's pacing, his hands moving, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and intellectual superiority. Then watch Shatner. Shatner is the immovable object. He sits eating an apple, calm, infuriatingly in control. The contrast is electric. Merritt brought a frantic modern energy that clashed beautifully with Shatner's classic theatrical stoicism. It wasn't just a clash of characters, it was a clash of acting styles of generations. But there is a moment later in the film where the facade drops. Kirk reveals the truth to David. "I'm your father." Merritt's reaction is subtle. It's a shift in the eyes, a softening. The arrogance drains away, leaving just a confused boy looking at a man he has hated by reputation his entire life. In that silence, Merritt proved he wasn't just Johnny Slash. He was a dramatic powerhouse. Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan was released in June 1982. It was a massive critical and commercial success. It saved the franchise. Critics singled out the new blood. They loved Kirstie Alley as Saavik, and they were intrigued by Merritt Butrick. The New York Times noted his intense, neurotic energy. Variety called him a compelling presence. For a moment, Merritt Butrick was on top of the world. He had a hit TV show and a hit movie in the same year. He was being profiled in magazines. He was attending premieres. He was the next big thing. But success is a dangerous drug for someone with bipolar disorder. The validation triggered a manic high. Merritt was everywhere. He was partying harder. The adrenaline of fame was mixing with the chemicals in his brain to create a dangerous cocktail of invincibility. He felt like he could do anything. He felt like the laws of gravity didn't apply to him. This is the phase of the illness that is most deceptive. To the outside world, he looked like a young man enjoying his success. He was charismatic, talkative, the life of the party. But those close to him saw the cracks. They saw the talking that wouldn't stop. They saw the grandiosity. They saw the sleepless nights. Merritt was running on an engine that was overheating, and he had no mechanic. There was another issue brewing. While Star Trek gave him a career, it also put him in a box. He was now Kirk's son. In the 80s, sci-fi was still considered a ghetto genre by serious filmmakers. Being a Star Trek actor was a double-edged sword. It gave you a fan base, but it often locked you out of prestige dramas. Directors looked at Merritt and saw a genre actor. Merritt desperately wanted to be taken seriously. He wanted to do plays. He wanted to do indie films. He wanted to be the next De Niro. But the scripts coming his way were for B-movie sci-fi and teen comedies. He began to resent the industry that had just embraced him. He felt misunderstood. He felt that his range was being ignored. And then there was the secret, the one he carried everywhere. As 1982 turned into 1983, the reports about the gay cancer were moving from the back pages of newspapers to the front pages. The fear in Los Angeles was palpable. People were disappearing. Guys you saw at the gym, guys you saw at the club, they would just vanish. And weeks later, you'd hear they were dead. Merritt was sexually active in the gay scene. He was smart. He read the news. He knew the math. Every cough, every night sweat, every moment of fatigue became a source of terrifying paranoia. Was he next? This fear fueled his mania. If he was going to die young, he had to live now. He had to work now. He had to feel everything now. He threw himself into the Los Angeles nightlife with a vengeance. The clubs, the Odyssey, the Probe, Studio One became his sanctuary and his hunting ground. He was looking for connection, for oblivion, for something to quiet the noise in his head. The slow suicide had begun, though no one called it that yet. It was just a young actor living fast. Paramount greenlit Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, almost immediately. Leonard Nimoy was set to direct. They needed David Marcus back. But the script for the third movie had a grim surprise. Harve Bennett, the producer, felt that for the death of Spock to be undone, there had to be a cost. There had to be a life for a life. Someone had to die. And it couldn't be one of the main 7 crew members. The target landed on David Marcus. When Merritt received the script, he reportedly had mixed feelings. On one hand, it was a paycheck, and it was a chance to work with Nimoy again. On the other hand, being killed off meant he was being written out of the franchise. It was a rejection, but there was a poetic tragedy to the way David Marcus was written in The Search for Spock. He isn't just killed, he sacrifices himself. He dies saving Saavik. In 1984, when they filmed the death scene on the Klingon planet set, the atmosphere was heavy. Merritt, knowing his character's fate, played the scenes with a haunting resignation. There is a moment right before the Klingon blade comes down. David looks up. He doesn't scream. He doesn't beg. He just accepts it. "I helped kill him," David says earlier in the film, referring to the Spock/Genesis planet situation. He carries guilt. Merritt played that guilt beautifully. And perhaps he was channeling his own. The guilt of his sexuality, the guilt of his addiction, the guilt of being defective in a world that demanded perfection. The year is 1984. Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, has just been released. In theaters across America, audiences are watching David Marcus, Merritt Butrick's character, die a hero's death. He is stabbed by a Klingon blade, sacrificing himself to save his friend. It is a noble, tragic end. The audience cries. Captain Kirk screams. The credits roll. But for Merritt Butrick, the morning after the premiere wasn't a celebration of a job well done. It was the beginning of a terrifying silence. In Hollywood, there is a brutal truth. You are only as good as your next job. For a brief, shining moment, Merritt had been the next big thing. He had the sitcom, he had the franchise, but now the sitcom was canceled and his franchise character was dead. He sat by the phone in his apartment waiting for the offers to roll in. He expected the industry to see his range. He had played comedy in Square Pegs and tragedy in Star Trek. Surely the scripts would pile up. They didn't. The phone didn't ring, or rather it didn't ring with the right calls. The scripts that did arrive were insults. They were rehashes of Johnny Slash, goofy sidekicks, stoned teenagers, aliens, the serious dramas, the prestige pictures, the roles that went to Sean Penn or Tom Cruise or Emilio Estevez. Those scripts never crossed his threshold. Merritt was 25 years old. In normal life, 25 is the beginning. In Hollywood, if you haven't cemented your place on the A-list by 25, the concrete starts to harden around your feet. You start to sink. This professional stalling coincided with a catastrophic escalation in his personal life. The slow suicide was shifting gears. It was no longer just about partying. It was about oblivion. In 1985, this was the year of the Breakfast Club and St. Elmo's fire. It was the dawn of the brat pack. Hollywood was obsessed with a very specific type of young actor: the rebel, the jock, the princess, the brain. These actors were selling a version of youth that was palatable to the masses. They were angsty, sure, but they were glossy. They looked good on a poster. Merritt Butrick did not fit into the brat pack. He was too weird. He was too intense. He didn't have that prom king energy that Rob Lowe had, nor did he have the safe, approachable nerdiness of Anthony Michael Hall. Merritt was dangerous. When he was on screen, you didn't know if he was going to kiss the girl or burn the set down. He had a feral quality that unnerved the mainstream casting directors of the mid-'80s. He watched from the sidelines as his peers, some of whom he had beaten out for roles just 2 years prior, ascended to superstardom. He saw them on the covers of Rolling Stone and Time. He saw them signing multi-million-dollar contracts. And he was sitting in West Hollywood doing lines of coke, wondering why the world had suddenly decided he wasn't invited to the party anymore. It was during this period, 1985 to 1986, that Merritt's undiagnosed bipolar disorder began to take full control of his life. Bipolar disorder is often romanticized in biographies as creative fire. The reality is much uglier. It is a biological hijacking of the self. In his manic phases, Merritt was electric. Friends from this era describe him as a whirlwind. He would have 1,000,000 ideas a minute. He would write frantically, scripts, poetry, plays, convinced that he was channeling divine inspiration. He wouldn't sleep for days. He would talk until his voice was hoarse, cornering people at parties. His eyes wide and unblinking, vibrating with an energy that was exhausting just to be around. During these highs, he felt invincible. He felt that his big break was just around the corner, that he was a genius, that the universe was bending to his will. But the crash always came. The depressive episodes of 1985 were darker than anything he had experienced before. When the mania subsided, it left behind a scorched earth of shame and exhaustion. He would disappear. He wouldn't answer his door. He would lay in the dark, paralyzed by a crushing sense of worthlessness. Hollywood, with its typical lack of nuance, labeled this behavior drug abuse. And to be fair, drugs were involved, but the drugs were a symptom, not the cause. He was using cocaine to sustain the mania because the mania felt like success. He was using heroin and alcohol to treat the depression because the depression felt like death. He was self-medicating a severe psychiatric condition with street narcotics. It was a recipe for disaster. While Merritt was fighting his internal war, the external world was changing. 1985 was the tipping point for the AIDS crisis. For years, it had been a rumor, a gay cancer affecting a small subculture. But on July 25, 1985, Rock Hudson, the ultimate symbol of Hollywood masculinity, publicly announced he had AIDS. He died in October. The impact of this cannot be overstated. It was an earthquake. Suddenly, AIDS wasn't just something that happened to those people in the bathhouses. It happened to movie stars. It happened to American icons. Panic swept through the industry. Casting directors started looking at actors differently. If you were thin, if you looked tired, if you were single and over 25, you were suspect. Makeup artists were terrified to touch actors who had skin lesions. Kissing scenes became contract disputes. Merritt was right in the crosshairs. He was a young gay man in West Hollywood. He was thin. He was prone to illness due to his lifestyle. The closet door, which he had cracked open slightly in his private life, slammed shut. He became terrified of being outed. If the industry found out he was gay, they would assume he had AIDS. If they assumed he had AIDS, he would never work again. This fear added a layer of paranoid anxiety to his already fragile mental state. He had to perform health every time he walked into a meeting. He had to act energetic, robust, and straight. Imagine the toll that takes. To be fighting a war in your mind, to be possibly sick in your body, and to have to walk into a room and smile like a toothpaste commercial. In the midst of this turmoil, Merritt landed a role that he hoped would be his salvation. The movie was Head Office. It was a satire of corporate America. It starred Judge Reinhold, who was fresh off the massive success of Beverly Hills Cop. The cast was stacked: Danny DeVito, Rick Moranis. It was a studio comedy with a budget. Merritt played a character named John Hudson. It was a small role, a junior executive, a yuppie suck-up. Why was this role important? Because it was normal. Merritt saw Head Office as his chance to prove he could play a suit. He wasn't an alien. He wasn't a punk rocker. He could be a young professional. He cut his hair. He wore the tie. He played the part with a frantic, nervous energy that actually worked well for a stressed-out corporate drone. He pinned his hopes on this film. If it was a hit, he could transition into the yuppie comedy genre that was exploding in the mid-'80s. Head Office was released in December 1985. It bombed. Critics hated it. Audiences ignored it. It holds a 0% rating on Rotten Tomatoes today. For Merritt, the failure of Head Office confirmed his worst fears. The mainstream didn't want him. The normal roles were dead ends. He retreated back into the shadows. If Hollywood wouldn't let him be a leading man and they wouldn't let him be a corporate yuppie, he would go where the freaks were welcome. He would go to the B movies. 1986 marked the beginning of Merritt's slide into the world of low-budget genre cinema. The film was Wired to Kill. The premise is pure 80s trash. In a dystopian near future, gangs roam the streets. A young man uses his computer skills to create booby traps to kill the gang members who hurt his family. Merritt played the villain. The gang leader. His character's name was Regis. If you want to see the state of Merritt Butrick's soul in 1986, watch Wired to Kill. He is unrecognizable from the clean-cut Starfleet officer of 2 years prior. His hair is a matted, bleached wreck. He wears leather and rags. He looks emaciated. But the performance is terrifying. Merritt didn't treat Wired to Kill like a paycheck gig. He attacked it with a rabid intensity. He plays Regis not as a cool villain, but as a drug-addled psychopath. He twitches. He screams. He drools. There is a scene where he is high on some futuristic drug, and the look in his eyes is not acting. It is the 1,000-yard stare of a man who has seen the bottom of the abyss. In one sequence, he dances manically while his gang destroys a house. It is a grotesque, hypnotic display. It is the behavior of a man in the grip of a severe manic episode, captured on 35mm film. The movie was a critical failure, dismissed as exploitation garbage. But for the few who saw it, Merritt's performance was disturbing. It was too real. It felt like watching a documentary of a breakdown. It is unclear exactly when Merritt received his HIV diagnosis. Medical records are private, and in the 80s, people went to great lengths to hide their status. But the timeline suggests that by 1986, he knew. The symptoms were likely starting. The night sweats, the swollen lymph nodes, the fatigue that no amount of cocaine could fix. Receiving an HIV diagnosis in 1986 was a psychological trauma that is hard for a modern audience to comprehend. There were no cocktails. There was no undetectable. There was only AZT and a calendar counting down the days. It was a sentence of death by torture. It meant you would lose your mind, your body would waste away, and you would be covered in lesions. And you would die alone because nurses were afraid to bring you food. Merritt was 26 years old. He was looking at his own extinction. How does a bipolar mind process a terminal diagnosis? It shattered him. The reckless behavior didn't stop, it accelerated. If he was going to die, he was going to die loud. He was angry. Angry at the industry. Angry at the virus. Angry at a God he wasn't sure he believed in. He began to alienate the few friends he had left. People who tried to tell him to slow down, to see a doctor, to get sober. He cut them off. He surrounded himself with enablers, people who didn't ask questions, people who just wanted to party with the guy from Star Trek. He was building a wall of noise to drown out the truth. By late 1986, Merritt Butrick had become a ghost in the industry. The casting directors who had once courted him now crossed his name off the lists. "He's trouble," they said. "He's on drugs." He looked sick. He was no longer auditioning for Paramount or Universal. He was auditioning for Canon Films. He was auditioning for direct-to-video horror. He was losing his apartment. The money from the Star Trek residuals was drying up, spent on drugs, spent on doctors he paid in cash to avoid insurance trails. He was slipping through the cracks of the city. There's a tragedy in the anonymity of this period. We know about the deaths of famous people. We know about Rock Hudson. We know about Freddie Mercury. But Merritt was in that dangerous middle ground, famous enough to be recognized, but not famous enough to be protected. He was alone. By 1987, the silence surrounding Merritt Butrick had acquired a physical weight. It wasn't just the quiet of a telephone that refused to ring. It was the suffocating heavy silence of a room where a secret is being kept. The slow suicide that friends had whispered about, the frantic partying, the reckless nights in West Hollywood, the chemical oblivion, had finally hit the wall of biological reality. The invincibility of youth, that dangerous delusion that had fueled his manic episodes and his career highs, evaporated the moment the diagnosis became undeniable. He was no longer just a troubled actor or an eccentric talent. In the eyes of the insurance adjusters and the hushed gossip circles of the commissary, he was a walking ghost. He was a statistic in a plague that the President of the United States had only just publicly acknowledged after years of indifference. The year 1987 was a turning point in the history of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and by extension a turning point in Merritt's tragedy. This was the year the FDA approved azithromycin, better known as AZT. It was the first glimmer of hope, the first weapon in a war that had previously been a slaughter. But hope in 1987 came with a price tag that was nothing short of extortionate. AZT was the most expensive drug in history at the time, costing upwards of $8,000 to $10,000 a year, an astronomical sum for an actor whose residuals were drying up and whose reputation was in tatters. This created a brutal, paradoxical trap for Merritt. To stay alive, he needed the drug. To buy the drug, he needed money. To get money, he needed to work. But to work, he had to present himself as healthy, vibrant, and insurable in an industry that treated physical frailty with the same compassion a shark shows a bleeding seal. This financial desperation forced Merritt into the darkest phase of his career. He could no longer afford to be choosy. He couldn't wait for the prestige drama or the complex character study. He had to take whatever was offered, regardless of the quality, the pay, or the physical toll. He became a mercenary for his own survival, selling the last reserves of his energy for a prescription bottle. And Hollywood, sensing his desperation, offered him roles that were not just bad, but actively cruel. Roles that seemed to mock his condition, exploiting his gaunt frame and manic energy for cheap thrills. The most egregious, heart-wrenching example of this exploitation came from the very franchise that had made him a star. In 1988, the producers of Star Trek: The Next Generation reached out. They weren't offering a return of David Marcus. That character was dead, and this was a new show set a century later. They were offering a guest spot in an episode titled Symbiosis. On the surface, it seemed like a kindness, a homecoming. Star Trek was family. It was the world that had given him his identity. But a closer look at the script reveals a level of insensitivity that borders on the sadistic. The role was T'Jon, the captain of an alien freighter. The character wasn't a hero, a scientist, or a diplomat. T'Jon was a junkie. The plot of Symbiosis revolves around two alien races, the Ornarans and the Breckians. The Ornarans, T'Jon's people, are plagued by a disease that can only be cured by a medicine provided by the Breckians. The twist, revealed by the Enterprise's Dr. Crusher, is that the medicine is actually a narcotic, and the disease is simply withdrawal symptoms. The Ornarans aren't sick, they are addicts, enslaved by a drug dealer disguised as a pharmacist. The role required Merritt to play a man in the throes of severe physical withdrawal. He had to shake, he had to sweat, he had to beg, he had to look like a man whose body was eating itself from the inside out. When Merritt arrived on the set of The Next Generation, the cast and crew were shocked. This wasn't the vibrant, intense young man who had gone toe-to-toe with William Shatner 6 years earlier. This was a shadow. The makeup department didn't need to do much work to make John look desperate. Merritt was already there. The virus was ravaging his system. He had lost a significant amount of weight, his cheeks were hollow, his eyes sunken and ringed with dark circles that no amount of concealer could fully hide. The method acting that critics would later praise, the trembling hands, the sheen of cold sweat, the frantic darting eyes, was largely biological. He was playing a drug addict while dying of a disease often associated with drug use, fueled by a real-life need for money to buy drugs to keep himself alive. The layers of irony were suffocating. Watching the episode today is a grueling experience. There is a scene on the bridge of the Enterprise where John pleads with Captain Picard for the medicine. Merritt's performance is electric, but it's the electricity of a short circuit. He throws his body around with a reckless disregard for his own frailty. He screams, he cries, he manipulates. It is a performance of raw, naked need. When John says, "Well, we will die without it," Merritt isn't just reciting a line from a script. He is speaking the terrifying truth of his own existence. He knew exactly what it meant to rely on a pill to see the sun rise. He knew exactly what it felt like to be at the mercy of a supplier. The producers, consciously or not, had captured the footage of a man confronting his own mortality and packaged it as a moral dilemma for Patrick Stewart to solve in 45 minutes. Critics at the time, unaware of his diagnosis, praised his commitment. They called him intense and visceral. They didn't realize they were watching a snuff film in slow motion. The cruelty of the industry lies in this disconnect. They applauded the simulation of suffering while ignoring the reality of the sufferer. Merritt walked away from that set with a paycheck that would buy him a few more months of AZT, but the cost to his dignity was incalculable. He had been forced to perform his own nightmare for an audience of millions, but Star Trek was just one stop on the tour of degradation. As 1988 dragged on, Merritt found himself in the purgatory of B-movie horror. He was cast in Fright Night Part 2, the sequel to the cult classic vampire film. He played Richie, the bumbling, eccentric best friend of the protagonist. In a cruel twist of typecasting, Richie is a character who is constantly afraid, constantly running, and eventually turned into a vampire, a creature of the undead, pale, gaunt, and blood-starved. The production of Fright Night. Part 2 was chaotic, but for Merritt it was a physical marathon he was ill-equipped to run. The role was physically demanding, requiring night shoots, stunts, and hours in the makeup chair. Co-stars from the film later recalled that Merritt seemed off. He was distant, often retreating to his trailer the moment the director yelled, "Cut." He lacked the manic social energy that had defined his earlier years. The bipolar highs were becoming less frequent, replaced by a crushing lethargic depression exacerbated by the physical toll of AIDS. The virus causes extreme fatigue, a bone-deep weariness that makes simply standing up feel like lifting a boulder. Yet Merritt had to be zany. He had to be the comic relief. There is a specific tragedy in watching a dying man try to be funny. In Fright Night Part 2, Merritt's comedic timing is still there. He was a professional after all. But there is a hollowness to it. His laughter doesn't reach his eyes. His physical comedy feels brittle, as if he might snap if he falls too hard. In the scenes where Richie is turned into a vampire, the makeup artist painted his skin white and added prosthetic fangs. But if you look closely at the unmasked scenes, the pallor is already there. The undead look wasn't a special effect. It was the progression of his illness. He was playing a monster who feeds on life, while his own life was being fed upon by a microscopic monster. The final insult came with a film called Death Spa. If Star Trek was a tragedy and Fright Night 2 was a struggle, Death Spa was a farce. It was a low-budget slasher movie about a haunted health club where the exercise machines kill the patrons. It is the kind of trashy exploitation cinema that fills the bins of video rental stores. Merritt was cast as David, the blind brother of the club owner. Playing a blind character required Merritt to wear opaque contact lenses or navigate the set without focusing his eyes. For an actor who was already experiencing the neurological symptoms of advanced HIV, dizziness, disorientation, cognitive fog, this was a nightmare. The blindness became a metaphor for his own lack of direction. He was stumbling through these sets, through these terrible scripts, grasping for a paycheck. The film is filled with gore, nudity, and bad dialogue. To see the actor who had once brought such nuance to the role of David Marcus reduced to dodging killer blenders in a haunted gym is heartbreaking. It was a humiliating end to a career that had started with such promise at CalArts. But why did he do it? Why not just quit? Why not go home to Florida? Because quitting meant admitting defeat. Quitting meant admitting he was sick. And in 1988, admitting you had AIDS was a social death that preceded the physical one. Merritt was terrified of the stigma. He saw what happened to others. He saw the way people bleached their cups after a sick person used them. He saw the way nurses wore hazmat suits to deliver dinner trays. He wanted to be an actor, not a leper. So he kept working, he kept pretending, he kept dying in front of the camera so he wouldn't have to die alone in a charity ward. The isolation during this period was absolute. His bipolar disorder, now compounded by the neurological effects of toxoplasmosis, made him paranoid. He pushed people away. He stopped returning calls to the few friends who were genuinely concerned. He became a recluse in his own life, leaving his apartment only to go to the set or the pharmacy. The slow suicide had evolved into a solitary confinement. He was trapped in a body that was failing him and a mind that was betraying him. The industry, for its part, was complicit in this isolation. Hollywood in the late 80s operated on a don't ask, don't tell policy regarding AIDS. Producers and casting directors knew who was sick. They saw the weight loss. They saw the lesions covered with heavy pancake makeup. But as long as the actor could hit their mark and say their line, they looked the other way. It was a transactional cruelty. They extracted the labor and offered no support. There were no fundraisers for Merritt Butrick. There were no benefit concerts. He wasn't famous enough to be a cause celebre. He was just a working actor who had become inconvenient. As 1988 drew to a close, Merritt's condition worsened rapidly. The AZT was no longer working effectively, or perhaps he could no longer afford the consistent struggle to obtain it. The opportunistic infections were taking hold. Pneumocystis pneumonia, the killer of so many AIDS patients, was a constant threat. His breathing became labored. His brilliant mind, once capable of memorizing entire plays and deconstructing complex characters, began to fracture under the pressure of the toxoplasmosis. The brain fog became a permanent state. He filmed his final scenes for Death Spa, looking like a man who was already halfway to the grave. The energy was gone. The spark was extinguished. What remained was a biological machine, going through the motions of survival. He was 29 years old, but he looked 40. The face that had once graced the covers of Teen Beat was now a mask of exhaustion. The tragedy of this period isn't just that he was dying, it's that he was dying while being forced to degrade his own talent. He wasn't allowed the dignity of a private exit. He was forced to sell pieces of himself, his image, his voice, his remaining strength, to a system that didn't care if he lived or died, as long as the film came in under budget. Star Trek used his withdrawal. Fright Night used his pallor. Death Spa used his desperation. And through it all, the photograph on the desk, the image of the vibrant, healthy David Marcus, remained frozen in time, a cruel reminder of the potential that was being systematically erased. The boy in the picture was immortal. The man in the room was disintegrating. The calendar turned to 1989, and with it, the precarious balancing act that Merritt Butrick had maintained for nearly 2 years finally collapsed. The sheer force of will that had allowed him to drag his failing body through the sets of Star Trek The Next Generation, Fright Night Part 2, and Death Spa evaporated. There was no more energy left to sell. The adrenaline of performance, which had served as his last reliable drug, was gone. In the early weeks of January 1989, Merritt retreated into the shadows of his apartment. To his neighbors, he was just a quiet, increasingly frail young man. To the few friends who still tried to reach him, he was a ghost. The physical deterioration was rapid and terrifying. The weight loss, which makeup artists had tried to hide with lighting and foundation just months prior, was now undeniable. He was skeletal. The vibrant, athletic frame that had once swung from the rigging of the Enterprise was now wasting away, the muscles atrophying as the virus consumed every reserve of energy he possessed. But the physical pain was secondary to the neurological horror that was unfolding. The slow suicide had entered its final, most cruel phase, the erasure of the self. The specific agent of Merritt's demise was toxoplasmosis, a parasitic infection that targets the brain in patients with advanced AIDS. For an actor, someone whose entire identity is built on memory, language, and the precise calibration of emotion, this was a fate worse than death. It began subtly in the weeks following the wrap of Death Spa, a forgotten name here, a stumbled sentence there. But by February 1989, the parasite was laying siege to his cognitive functions. The lesions forming on his brain were short-circuiting the electrical pathways of his mind. Imagine the terror of a man who prided himself on his intellect, suddenly finding himself unable to navigate his own thoughts. The scripts he had memorized, the poetry he had written, the sharp, biting wit of Johnny Slash, it was all becoming inaccessible, locked behind a wall of static. Confusion replaced clarity. The manic energy of his bipolar disorder, which had once driven him to heights of creative ecstasy, was replaced by a dull, frightened fog. He was losing the ability to distinguish between the characters he played and the reality he lived in. This cognitive decline forced a total withdrawal from the world. He couldn't risk being seen. In Hollywood, reputation is everything, and the rumor mill is vicious. If word got out that Merritt Butrick was losing his mind, it would be twisted into stories of drug psychosis or madness. He chose silence over scrutiny. He locked the doors. He pulled the blinds. He prepared to die in the dark. By late February or early March, keeping him at home became impossible. He was likely transported to a hospital in Los Angeles, perhaps Midway Hospital or Cedars-Sinai, admitted under a shroud of privacy. Entering an AIDS ward in early 1989 was a descent into a specific kind of hell. It was a place of hushed tones and terrified glances. The medical staff, overwhelmed and often underprotected, moved like astronauts in a toxic landscape. The rooms were filled with young men, actors, dancers, writers, designers, all cut down in their prime. The sound of the ward was the rhythmic hiss of respirators and the beep of monitors, punctuated by the coughing that signaled the presence of pneumocystis pneumonia. Merritt lay there, stripped of his costumes, his accolades, and his public persona. There were no fan letters here. There were no autograph seekers. There was only the sterile white of the hospital sheets and the smell of antiseptic. The tragedy of his hospitalization was the profound isolation. In 1989, the stigma of AIDS was at its zenith. Friends who had partied with him at Studio One, who had shared his cocaine and his laughter, did not come to visit. The fear of association was too strong. To visit a dying friend was to admit proximity to the plague. So they stayed away. They sent flowers, perhaps, or they did nothing at all, convincing themselves that remembering him as he was a kindness rather than an act of cowardice. Merritt was left with a very small circle, likely his immediate family and perhaps a singular loyal friend who dared to cross the threshold of the ward. They watched as the brilliant light behind his eyes began to dim. As March progressed, the toxoplasmosis advanced. Merritt slipped into a state of semi-consciousness. The seizures would have been exhausted his frail body. The periods of lucidity became rarer. In those fleeting moments of awareness, one wonders what he thought about. Did he think about the Genesis cave? Did he think about the applause? Or did he think about the wasted years, the frantic search for love in the wrong places, the slow suicide that he had been enacting for a decade? There is a cruel irony that his most famous role, David Marcus, died a hero's death, saving his friends, defiant to the end. Merritt's death was not heroic in the cinematic sense. It was quiet. It was messy. It was human. He was fighting a battle against his own biology, a war where the enemy was his own blood. On St. Patrick's Day, March 17, 1989, the fight ended. The city of Los Angeles was preparing for parades and parties. Green beer was flowing in the bars of West Hollywood. But in a quiet hospital room, Merritt Butrick took his final breath. He was 29 years old. There was no sudden stop to the music. The world didn't pause. Traffic continued to flow on the 405. Scripts continued to be written. The industry that had chewed him up and spit him out simply kept turning. The immediate aftermath of Merritt's death was defined by a stunning, suffocating silence. When a star dies today, the internet breaks. Tributes pour in instantly. In 1989, the death of an actor from AIDS was treated as a shameful secret to be buried. There were no front-page headlines. Variety and The Hollywood Reporter ran standard, brief obituaries, listing his credits but glossing over the cause of death. The phrase, "died of AIDS," was still a taboo, often replaced with euphemisms like long illness or respiratory failure. Paramount Pictures did not issue a press release mourning the loss of Kirk's son. The cast of Star Trek, many of whom were unaware of how sick he had been, found out through the grapevine or days later in the trade papers. There was no grand funeral. There was no televised memorial. Merritt Butrick simply ceased to exist in the public consciousness. It was as if he had been edited out of the film of life. His body was cremated, his ashes scattered. There is no headstone for fans to visit. There is no statue. For a man who had desperately wanted to leave a mark, to be remembered for his art, this erasure was the final indignity. The industry moved on with terrifying speed. Roles that Merritt might have played went to other actors. The eccentric genius slot was filled by new faces. The 80s were ending, and Hollywood was eager to wash away the grime of the decade, the drugs, the excess, and the sickness. Merritt was a casualty of that cleanup. But the story didn't end in that hospital room. It ended 2 years later, in 1991, on a movie screen. In Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, there is a scene that transcends acting. Captain Kirk, weary and aging, stands in the dim light of his quarters. He picks up a photograph from his desk. It is not a prop created by an art department. It is a real publicity still of Merritt Butrick from 1982. Young, vibrant, his eyes burning with that signature intensity that once promised a massive career. William Shatner looks at the photo. He places it gently on the desk. He doesn't say a word. In that 3 seconds of silence, the fourth wall shatters. We aren't watching a captain mourn a fictional son. We are watching a cast mourn a lost brother. That photograph was the only eulogy Merritt ever received. It captured the tragedy perfectly. He was forever frozen as the beautiful, promising boy in the frame, while the real man had been allowed to rot away in the dark. Merritt Butrick was not a martyr. He was not a saint. He was a complex, flawed human being whose biology declared war on his ambition. He was a man who felt too much in a world that rewarded numbness. He tried to quiet the noise in his bipolar mind with drugs, and he tried to hide his sexuality to survive in an industry of smoke and mirrors. He didn't just die of AIDS, he died of exhaustion. He died from the sheer brutal effort of trying to be what Hollywood wanted him to be, while his own mind was screaming for release.